This episode is on Manifest Destiny, the belief or the views of the Americans as they expanded west into the regions that are Texas, Oregon, and California. We will look at the politics of the period and then look at the events that occurred that led to that expansion, the annexation of Texas, the annexation of Oregon, and then the annexation really of the entire Southwest after the Mexican War. We will deal with that, which will bring California to the United States in a separate episode called the Mexican War. This one will look at Texas and Oregon. First, we need to define manifest destiny. The Americans viewed their destiny to spread this new civilization, this new republic that they had created and that they had succeeded at. Remember that it was a very unusual type of government at the time. So they were a growing democracy, as we've read in the earlier chapters. So with the Jackson era forward, the vote was spread broadly across the male population, and most of whom were white, as many of you have pointed out. The democracy meant then that they believed that government could be consensual, right? Remember the term consent of the people was very important to the colonists, then Americans. And so they had created a consensual government where the people decided on who their leaders were, and they had the opportunity to do this every 4 years with their central leader, and then at 2- and 6-year intervals with the other leaders. They also believed that individual liberties should be protected, and they were with the first 10 amendments. And they believed in the priority of private property in law, that laws should always protect private property of individuals. So those were the 3 most important things about this new democracy that they created, and that they believed they had a God-given obligation to spread as far as they could. So they believed that this manifest destiny was God-given, and that's very important to the concept of manifest destiny, that they really believed that their religion was behind them as well. So they had a religious zeal that would lead them to try to compete with empires. The United States never really builds much of an empire. They tend to add territory and make it into part of the United States rather than conquering regions and setting up colonies and making them into subject states, which is what the other imperial powers were doing up to this time. But they would go west and they would add them all in as eventually states, as we know, into the United States. So they were in an empire building period, and they will add lots of territory under this view of manifest destiny. Politics in this growing democracy is getting increasingly raucous. So I want to talk a little bit about the 1840 political environment. There's 2 presidencies, 1840 election and then the 1844 election. The 1840 election will bring in the Whig Party, and I think some of you have written in the discussion board about that Whig Party, a very temporary party in U.S. politics. And then in 1844, we'll get Polk elected. And Polk, the president, James Polk, is much more important in the 1840s because he will be president as all these territories are added to the United States. So there's a great expansion west under the presidency of Polk. A few things about these elections. We have the first phenomenon of a log cabin campaign, meaning that people who were campaigning, the presidential candidates, ran campaigns that emphasized their ordinary upbringing, and that's what the term log cabin campaign has come to mean. In this day and age, they literally meant log cabins, or to be born in a log cabin. But that's what they started to try to convince the people. If you've got a growing democracy, You've got to convince the people that you are like them. And we still see that phenomenon today, really. I mean, all the candidates seem to want to emphasize their ordinary upbringings, and so they're all kind of running a log cabin campaign, even all the way up to the modern day. We also see the beginning of the penny presses, and it means exactly what it sounds like. It cost a penny to buy a newspaper, and here on the right-hand side you have the New York Sun, and they started to become very influential in campaigns and for the political parties. So we get the invention of the penny press, and then, as we said, the temporary phenomenon in the 1840s of the Whig Party, and the Whig Party will win their candidate in this 1840 election. And that candidate was William Henry Harrison, and he was the general who defeated the Prophet at the Battle of Tippecanoe, defeated the Prophet in the Prophet settlement. Remember that the Prophet was the brother to Tecumseh, and he was a religious leader and a religious uniter of Native Americans, and that William Henry Harrison was sent up into the Old Northwest to a river called Tippecanoe, and he ended up removing the settlement and attacking the settlement that the Prophet had there at the river Tippecanoe, and that was the Battle of Tippecanoe. And he had a vice presidential candidate who was actually from the South. So William Henry Harrison was from the Old Northwest and a Whig, and Tyler was his vice presidential candidate. He's more important because William Henry Harrison died 3 weeks after he was elected. So Tyler was the president for the whole time. He was a Virginian and a Southerner, and so had many sympathies that would resonate with Democrats. So his own party saw him as a Democrat in Whig clothing. A Democrat in Whig clothing, and his own party rejected him finally. So John Tyler is known as the president without a party. And the reason for that is he did things that were antithetical to the Whig party agenda. One was to veto a new bank, and the Whig party would expel him from their party for that. The Congress tries to impeach him because he vetoed a tariff that they were going to put on. Remember that the Northerners and the Whigs believed in economic nationalism, and that means they wanted to really build the economic capacity of the United States and expand it, obviously, to the west, but far and wide. And tariffs were helpful to your industrialists in particular. So when he vetoes the tariff, that's really a pro-South veto, and not an opposition to the northern commercial interests. So the Whig Party really represented those northern commercial interests. Because of what they would call his shenanigans, his whole cabinet resigned with the exception of William Webster, who was the Secretary of State, and he was engaged in a peace negotiation with Britain at the time. And so I want to look at the diplomacy very quickly that's going on with the United States and mostly with Britain, and then we'll turn to the expansion west and U.S. Partly aggression, partly not. I mean, the Spanish Empire is declining, so the Southwest has lost its colonial status, and now it's becoming a new country, and so there's lots of instability. But you want to see this in the context of broader diplomacy that's going on between Canada and the United States. Canada is still subject to the British Empire, still subject of the British Empire, and it's periodically got rebellions against that British Empire. Well, in the United States, they were supportive of these rebellions and the independence of Canada. And in one incident in diplomacy, a ship on the Great Lake, I think it was on Huron, the Caroline, was packed with arms and ammunition, and supplies for rebels in Canada against the British. And the British quickly, or knowing this, attacked the ship and burnt it, and stopped, obviously, the arms being supplied to rebels in Canada. And you want to see, just, that's a very tense moment for U.S. diplomacy with the British. They went to war with the British on the Maine-Canada border. So the border between Maine, the state of Maine, and Canada had not been completely defined yet. And this war was called the Aroostook War. It took place in 1938. Some of these things are going on at the end of Jackson's administration. And this was a border war. And they would finish this war with a treaty, and that's what Webster was engaged in at the time of when John Tyler's cabinet was resigning itself. So the treaty that's signed for this, to end this Aroostook War, was the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and it basically signed over in 1942 some lands to the United States. So basically the United States and Britain finished the line that was dividing the Canadas from the U.S., and the U.S. gained hundreds of thousands of acres. So we did gain a lot of acreage, but not a whole vast territory in this treaty. So it was well negotiated by Daniel Webster. This will seal the Canadian border on the east coast, and then we'll have only the west coast to deal with. Another tense moment in British diplomacy, or American diplomacy with Britain, was the case of the Creole. The Creole was a slave ship, and it was carrying slaves, which were, as you guys know, outlawed in 1808. So the international slave trade was outlawed, and the slaves mutinied and took over the ship, and the ship was captured by the British. And the British then arrested the slaves that had mutinied and taken the ship. There were 19 of them. And they had tried the case, and the British justice system found that slavery was, and the slave trade was illegal, and the slaves had every right to defend themselves and to seek their own freedom. So they were not guilty of any mutiny. They were guilty of defending their own private rights. And they freed all, well, there were 19, and they freed 17 because 2 had died in the meantime in prison. But that was another tense moment between the United States and Britain. And so just broadly, if we could step back for a moment and look at, well, how had relations changed with Britain and the United States? Just to recall, right, the Revolution, 1776. They came back again 20 years later and fought a war in 1812. And even though they once again won a lot of the battles, they lost the war ultimately. We've just seen they're in a conflict in Canada over a border, and they signed off on a treaty that gave some territory to the United States. And then they would settle with the United States, who would negotiate for the Oregon Territory and the completion of the border of Canada. Now, the United States, there was a lot of pressure to make that border all the way up to what is Alaska today, the 54th parallel. And Polk, who is president in 46, is going to negotiate for the Washington border, and so the completion of the line between Canada and the United States at Washington, the 49th parallel. And that's important because since Polk didn't ask for what essentially is British Columbia today, the British were willing to sign off on this treaty. So the negotiation that went on was, okay, the United States is not going to try to get from you all the way up to the 54th parallel. And we will settle for the 49th. And on Britain's side, they looked at it as, well, there's a whole bunch of Americans in the Oregon Territory. Remember that the Oregon Trail is going great guns at this point. And so we don't, it's not really in our interest to fight for this territory since there's so many Americans. And the Columbia River, which is the main river, comes out on a big silt bed, so it's not really a great port. And we can, one, save our good port in Vancouver, and two, the Americans in this treaty for Oregon are going to guarantee all British citizens the lands that they have bought, the private property that British citizens have. So they guaranteed all British citizens private property. They said, we'll take the 49th parallel, the line at the state line at northern Washington state today, and they secured their best port, which was at Vancouver. And so everybody was happy in this settlement, and the United States had the Oregon Territory. So that's how Oregon was added. It was actually added after Texas had already been annexed. And the only reason that Texas was annexed was because they understood that the Oregon Territory deal was going to go through, right? So U.S. expansion then. Texas will be annexed with the understanding that Oregon was just about to be settled, and it would be annexed. And then after a war, California and the Southwest as well, but the big thing was California, would be annexed. So the Mexican War will take place between 1846 and 1848. So that's what we have ahead here. Let's take a look then at Texas itself. If you look at this map, you can see Texas as it stood when they declared their independence along this yellow line here. And all the way down, this is the Rio Grande River and the coast, obviously, on to the Gulf here. And that was Texas as the Texans understood it. As far as Mexico understood, they two things. They never saw Texas as independent, and they rejected when it finally was annexed to the United States. And then when they did accept that it was independent and annexed, they said that the Nunce River, and I believe it's right here, just about dead center of Texas, was the border and not the Rio Grande. So there was lots of conflict with the Mexican government over Texas. But what we want to see is how Texas becomes independent from its the Mexican overlordship and what happens. But it's very key to this to understand that the Spanish Empire is failing in this 19th century, and it actually had been failing for 200 years, but the Latin Americas would start to demand their independence in the beginning of the 19th century. As far as Texas goes, once it's independent, I always like to talk to students, well, there are a lot of wolves out there in the international world that would like a piece of Texas or the territory, and so I just like to show you what the international world is after with Texas. So this Lone Star Republic, right, it's its own republic for 9 years here. Britain was interested in mining products, and so trade and mining rights in the Texas region. Mexico obviously was interested in the territory itself and keeping its claim to the territory. The United States would like to add territory to its federal government, but has problems, right? As you guys know, whether it comes in as a slave state or not becomes a big issue. And since there are slaves in Texas, when it is annexed, it's assumed it will be a slave state. France would like to get some trade treaties. So France, like Spain, both of them are failing or receding empires, at least as far as the Americas are concerned. And then Spain was the former colonizer of the Texas region. So they too would like to lay some claims, although they are very much a weakened state on a global scale. So what happens? How is it that so many Americans end up in the state of Texas? Well, as the Spanish Empire is in its decline, and then in 1810, when Mexico declares its independence, they want population in the region. So Texas and the Southwest did have some native population, but there were large areas of it that were unpopulated, so they're trying to draw in populations to start to build economy in Texas. So they encouraged U.S. colonists in the beginning. So the central Mexican government was encouraging colonists. The Spanish had also encouraged colonists, and they encouraged them in this fashion, that they gave them a good price for land if they brought colonists with them. So Stephen Austin and Sam Houston are two of the biggest. As you know, we have the city of Austin and the city of Houston today because of that, are two big landowners in Texas who brought colonists with them. So Stephen Austin is our example of that. I guess wealthy landowner who also was instrumental in encouraging colonists to come in with him and take up the land that he bought from the Mexican government. In 1821, Mexican independence is finally sealed. You know, it's a 10-year thing, so while all the conflict with Spain is going on and with Mexico, the American colonists are settling in the Texas region. So by 1830, though, the Mexican policy is going to change. So they're a little bit leery. They got more Americans there than they have Tejanos, which were the Hispanic Texans. So you have Texans who were the U.S. citizens that were in the region that is Texas, and you have Tejanos who were Hispanics who were in the region of Texas. And there were more American citizens than there were Tejanos at the time. So Mexico decides, wait a second, let's stop this immigration, because this is creating conditions that would lead to what it does lead to, which is independence and then annexation to the United States, right? So they forbid immigration. They put forts on the frontier, so they started to move some of their military to the frontier in case they needed to do something, which they would need to do something. And by 1834, I bring in the statistic that I have, which is there are about 20,000 United States colonists and about 2,000 slaves with them in the region that is Texas today. In 1835, the Central Mexican government takes a bold step and decides to end local autonomy and to enforce its will in the northern states. Texas is not the only northern state that is in rebellion. There are other states in rebellion against the Central Mexican government in the north. So there were other states that wanted to be independent. Now they don't end up independent, so Texas is sort of unique in that. The Central Mexican government then will send its federal troops under Santa Anna to the north to get some control of the region, and he's up there in a punitive capacity. So he's up there to arrest people, and they actually do arrest Austin temporarily for declaring or talking about independence, which, as you know, in any country is considered treasonous, right? So they will arrest him temporarily, but that only inspires the United States citizens to band together to revolt against the Mexican government, because they don't see any other path, in the sense that they see, well, they're going to come up here and they're going to repress any sort of interest or movement for independence, which is what they wanted to do ultimately. Again, it was the Americans in Texas that wanted this independence, and they will declare independence. And it's one thing to declare independence, and it's another thing to achieve it, right? So in 1836 they declared independence. The Federales, the Mexican federal military, met them at battles, right? And the most significant are the one that the Texans lost, the Alamo, and then the one that they won, San Jacinto. So you guys should know that the Alamo was a fort on the frontier with Mexico that the Federales under Santa Anna attacked, And the Texans in the Alamo fought to the last man. So there were 187 Texans and 187 that were dead at the end of the Alamo. So they were willing to fight to the death, in other words, to defend an independent Texas against federal troops from central Mexico. And that's why the Alamo is so famous today, right? Because it shows the loyalty or the zeal by which these Texans were willing to fight to secure their independence. Sam Houston would be the general that will defeat Santa Anna finally at the River San Jacinta. So the Battle of San Jacinta is often described as a surprise attack, which personally I have a little bit of trouble. You've got 2,000 to 3,000 troops under Sam Houston that show up to meet the Mexican military at San Jacinto and at the river, and they were unprepared for battle. That's true. And then they got caught in fighting, so I guess it was somewhat of a surprise. But 2,000 to 3,000 troops coming at you could not be too much of a surprise. They captured Santa Anna and made him prisoner, and then they would trade him back to Mexico later. But they made him a prisoner, and they forced the signing of a treaty, which is why Mexico never accepted the treaty and always contested its legitimacy. So Mexico never accepted that Texas was independent. But for the Texans, they saw themselves as independent, and now they amazingly start to act as their own independent country. And this is an interesting tale. For 9 years they act as an independent country. They claim the Rio Grande. Mexico, when it does accept that it's a separate state, says no, it's the Nunce River, which is about 150 miles north of the Rio Grande. They acted as an independent country in expansion, so they wanted to expand. Texas, as the Lone Star Republic, wanted to expand west, and they executed some raids on Santa Fe. They built warships in the Gulf, and they actively enacted diplomacy, right, signing treaties with both France and Britain. And all the time they were trying to be annexed to the United States. So they declared independence in 1936, and for 8 years they sought state status in the United States. They sought to be annexed to the United States. The reason that the United States Congress did not annex them was the slave issue. And once again, that was resolved when it appeared that the Oregon Territory would be added to the United States. So the North, knowing that there are already slaves in Texas, knows that it's going to come in as a slave state because they'll make their own state constitution. And with 2,000 slaves and probably more than 20,000 Americans by this time, it was obviously going to be a slave state. So it took 8 years of applying, and then finally in 1945, with the Oregon Territory coming in, they annexed it. So it got annexed in 1945, and that was under the administration of James Polk here. And Polk became president in 44, and he was a Democrat. So the Whigs lost, and Tyler had one administration and no party. Poor guy. So the Democrats won here. They were representative of the West and the South. And the campaign that Polk ran on illustrates this. Right? He ran on a campaign of manifest destiny, that it was the U.S. destiny, as we said, God-given mission to expand their system into other places, and the West was the logical direction to do this, and that's what he ran on. It was a manifest destiny that all this Western territory would be added to the United States. So under him, they will annex Texas. They will add the Oregon Territory, negotiate for the Oregon Territory. He also ran on low tariffs, to keep tariffs low, which kept the South happy and the West happy. And he ran on the idea that there should be an independent treasury. Finally, right, he will add the Oregon Territory, as we said, at the 49th parallel, or the latitude. That is the 49th latitude. And we also discussed Britain signed, because what they wanted ultimately was the Vancouver, and they weren't so concerned about the Columbia River, which didn't seem a good place for a port. And that's where we end with this initial episode on Manifest Destiny and the expansion west in the 1840s. The last thing that we'll need to do is in the next episode on the Mexican War and the adding of the Southwest to the United States.